So, I watched Midsommar, or Midsommar, whichever your preference is.
What time is it?
It's 9 p.m.
What do you mean?
What do you mean?
That can't be right. The sky is blue.
An A24 horror film written and directed by Ari Aster. This is the second time I've seen it. The first time was back in July when it was in theaters. And man, this movie is a trip. So, Ari Aster also wrote and directed Hereditary, another A24 horror film, which was a pretty big deal when it came out.
I just don't want to put any more stress on my family.
I remember everybody talking about it and loving it and calling it the scariest movie of our generation, being touted around as the new Exorcist. That being said, I have to give it up for Ari Aster because coming off of that had to have its challenges, I'm sure. Midsommar is completely different from Hereditary and stands solidly on its own, the only similarities being Ari Aster's style of horror and movie making. But Midsommar isn't only different in its relation to Hereditary, it's different in its relation to the horror genre itself. Which isn't to say this movie isn't scary. The opening scene of this movie is the most disturbing I've seen in memory. It reminds me of the first time I saw 2017's It.
Hiya, Georgie.
That opening scene absolutely shocked and horrified me when I first saw it. But I have to give the number one spot to the opening of Midsommar because it goes beyond just being shocked. And even when I know it's coming, it still gets to me. I just had this uneasy feeling in my gut and I could feel my heart dropping. Throughout this movie, there are those disturbing moments and they're pretty spread out. It's not a constant flow of jump scares and gore. This is a slow movie that takes most of its time setting things up, building up tension, and making you ask questions. Now, I could definitely see this being unappealing to some people, and I think there were even a few moments where it felt like I was just waiting rather than enjoying it. But most of the time, I enjoyed these slow build-up moments, and I really appreciate this approach to horror, which I guess you could describe as a quality over quantity approach. There are a few really well done disturbing scenes in this movie that really affect me, rather than a bunch of bullshit that only makes me jump. This movie also looks really good, which is almost strange for a horror movie. And I'm not talking about the look of the film, which does look good, but the setting more so. It's set in this beautiful Amish-type village in Sweden, and it is almost always bright and sunny. That's something I remember people were talking about when Midsommar was coming out, the fact that it's this horror movie set in daylight, which is something definitely worth talking about. There's something kind of unsettling about horror taking place in the daylight, and thematically that contrast works really well for this movie. The contrast between beautiful and disturbing things brings me onto the score, which is by Bobby Krilic. At times it's unsettlingly, almost overly cheery, and at other times it shifts to this really deep, dark tone that fits so well with the disturbing moments in this movie. And then other times it walks the line just between the two. I love this score so much, I just listen to it sometimes and I'll feel like a psychopath for it. I'm noticing how much I'm using the word disturbing, so I'm gonna stop. But before I do, I have to give credit to the acting in this movie. Because in those moments, it is the performances that truly make them disturbing ones. The whole cast was great, even the ones with the most minor roles. I felt like I could feel through the screen just how seriously they were taking this movie and their roles. And they all really delivered. And everyone was great. But I really have to give it up for Florence Pugh. The emotions she was constantly portraying in this movie and the subtlety of them sometimes was just amazing and added so much to the movie. Now, I'm done with the D word, but I'm only getting started with the word weird because this movie is weird, man. This movie really explored the horror and weirdness. Not in that weirdness genuinely freaks you out, but more in that it just makes you uncomfortable. And I think there's definitely horror in discomfort. But sometimes in discomfort, we also find laughter. I remember when I saw this in theaters, the guy next to me could not help but laugh at some of the weird scenes in this movie. Afterwards, I saw online a lot of people were talking about doing the same thing. And I don't blame them. Honestly, okay, so I didn't laugh for most of these parts, these weird parts, because I was just so drawn into the movie. But there was one scene where I couldn't help it. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I think it's just a reaction to that weird form of horror, to that discomfort. Because it is just so strange, so weird, so uncomfortable that you can't really help but laugh. And now that there are reports of Ari Aster wanting to make a zonky nightmare comedy, I think he knew exactly what he was doing. So, after Hereditary and now Midsommar, Ari Aster has found praise for these artsy horror movies he makes. Now, while artsy movies tend to be pretty divisive amongst the general public, if you know me, you know I love these artsy kinds of movies that have depth and meaning to them, and I love exploring that depth and trying to figure out that meaning in these kinds of movies. Even though I have trouble with the figuring it out part most of the time, still, most of the time, I try not to look that stuff up because I feel like part of the experience is interpreting it for yourself. But I think I might have looked it up when I first watched Midsommar in theaters, because watching it this time around, I felt like I understood it a little more than I usually would with a movie like this. But anyways, I won't get too much into that. I don't want to give anything away, but I felt like it was worth bringing that up because knowing it's an artsy kind of movie can turn people off or onto it. So that's about all I have to say about Midsommar. I give it 4 out of 5 stars. It's one trippy horror movie. Yeah, that's it. Cut. Never know how to end these cuts. Cut.